The studio lights glared down as the cameras rolled, their heat blending with the tension that filled the room. Pam Bondi, polished in her confidence, leaned forward with a smirk that had silenced many before. She pointed directly at Ibrahim Traoré, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Without our framework, without our rules, your nations collapse into chaos. You need us to function." The words echoed like a decree, an assertion born of decades of power, influence, and Western dominance. But across from her sat a man who had weathered storms far greater than studio debates. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who had ignited hope across Africa, did not flinch. His gaze was steady, his silence deliberate. He let the words hang, allowing the audience to feel the weight of Bondi's arrogance. And then, with a calm yet thunderous presence, he spoke. "You say we need your rules. But tell me, who wrote them? Who benefited from them? Certainly not us. Africa doesn't need borrowed chains disguised as order. We will write our own laws, laws born from our soil, our people, and our history." The crowd shifted, a murmur rising like a storm brewing in the distance. Bondi's smirk faltered for a moment, her rehearsed certainty meeting a resistance she hadn't expected. Traoré's words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a declaration. In that instant, it wasn't just a debate on television, it was a clash of worlds, a fracture in the narrative long held by those who believed Africa's destiny could be dictated from afar. Pam Bondi straightened in her chair, brushing off the sting of Traoré's words with a dismissive laugh. She leaned into the microphone, her voice smooth, rehearsed, dripping with authority. "Strong words, Mr. Traoré, but without structure, nations unravel. You call them chains, but we call them laws. They bring stability, they prevent collapse. Without us, Africa would drown in its own disorder." The studio audience hushed again, caught between the polished certainty of a seasoned prosecutor and the rising fire of a leader who refused to bow. Traoré did not rush to respond. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed directly on Bondi's. The camera zoomed in, catching every detail of his unwavering composure. When he finally spoke, his tone was low but commanding, the kind of voice that seemed to fill the entire room. "Stability? Tell me, Ms. Bondi, what stability did your so-called laws bring when they carved up Africa like a feast? What justice was there when resources were stolen, when our people were silenced under the weight of foreign control? Do not disguise your profit as our protection. Your laws were never meant for us, they were designed to serve you." The audience reacted sharply, gasps, nods, whispers spreading like wildfire. Even the hosts exchanged nervous glances, realizing they were witnessing something more than a simple debate. Bondi blinked, her polished facade cracking as Traoré pressed on. "Africa does not need your laws to breathe. We are not a continent of children waiting for rules handed down from above. We are nations with voices, with rights, with a destiny you cannot write for us. And the day you understand that, the illusion of your authority will finally vanish." His words struck like a hammer against stone. The air grew heavy, as if the walls of the studio themselves trembled under the force of a truth long suppressed. For the first time, Bondi looked unsettled, not because she lacked words, but because she realized the old rhetoric no longer worked. The world was listening, and the power dynamic was shifting before their eyes. Pam Bondi adjusted her papers, her lips pressing into a thin line. The studio lights glared above her, but it was the unshakable weight of Traoré's words that made her shift in her seat. She tried to regain control, raising her hand slightly as though to reclaim authority. "With all due respect, Mr. Traoré," she began, her tone sharpening, "you speak of history as if the present can be defined by the past. The truth is, every nation needs structure, and whether you admit it or not, Western systems have provided the frameworks that allow your nations to even function today. Without us, without our rules, you would not even have this platform." There was a silence, but it was not agreement, it was disbelief. The crowd felt the sting in her words, the blunt claim that Africa's progress was owed to outside hands. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré, his face calm yet burning with controlled intensity. He leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried not just across the studio, but into the hearts of those watching around the world. Without you? Traoré's words cut like a blade. Without you, Africa would not be burdened with scars that still bleed. Without you, our lands would not have been stripped, our people enslaved, our future stolen piece by piece. Do not tell me we should be grateful for the chains that bind us. Do not tell me the lock is a gift simply because you hand us the key after centuries of suffering. Gasps swept through the audience. Bondi opened her mouth to respond, but Traoré did not stop. His voice rose, steady yet powerful, carrying the full weight of defiance. You see power as a favor. But Africa does not ask for favors, we demand respect. And respect is not written in your rules. Respect is earned, shared, and built by those who refuse to kneel. You claim to have given us a framework. We are tearing it down, brick by brick, to build our own house. And this time, no one will live in it but us. The atmosphere crackled with tension, almost electric. Bondi looked unsettled, caught between indignation and disbelief. The camera caught her tightening her jaw, her polished confidence faltering as Traoré's words struck deeper than any legal argument. For the first time, the power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and the audience could feel it. Pam Bondi tried to steady herself, her practiced smile straining at the edges. She adjusted her microphone, eager to counter the storm of applause that erupted for Traoré's words. You speak of chains and scars, she retorted, her voice dripping with impatience, but what you fail to recognize is that civilization, order, and law come at a cost. Progress is not built on anger, it is built on discipline. And whether you like it or not, the West has always been the one to set the standard. She leaned back, nodding to herself as if she had delivered an unshakable truth. The audience, however, was restless. Some clapped politely, but most waited for Traoré's reply. His silence stretched, his eyes steady, scanning the room as though measuring every heart present. Then he spoke, low but sharp, his words echoing with a power that cut through the lights and cameras. The West set the standard? Traoré repeated, his voice thick with restrained fire. Yes, you set the standard, for exploitation, for plunder, for turning human lives into commodities. You set the standard for greed, for disguising theft as progress, and for writing history to praise yourselves while burying our dead beneath the footnotes. The room went still. Bondi's eyes flickered, her composure faltering once more. Traoré did not blink, his gaze locked on her like a challenge carved in stone. He leaned closer into the microphone, his voice rising, steady as a drumbeat. You call it discipline. We call it domination. You call it law. We call it control. And if you think those words, order, rules, civilization, can erase centuries of pain, then you are mistaken. What you built on our soil was never order, it was a cage. And cages do not teach discipline, they teach rebellion. The crowd erupted, cheers, whistles, and applause shaking the walls of the studio. Some rose to their feet, their hands pounding together as though they were striking chains off their wrists. Bondi pressed her lips together, her rebuttal caught in her throat. Traoré, calm amidst the storm, straightened his posture and finished his point. You say progress is not built on anger. Perhaps. But it will never again be built on our silence. Pam Bondi sat rigidly, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She forced a smile, but the tremor in her jaw betrayed her unease. The cameras caught every flicker of her discomfort, and across the world, viewers leaned closer to their screens, waiting for her to respond. Mr. Traoré, she began, her voice faltering before she steadied it, your anger is misplaced. Without the structure, investment, and oversight of the West, Africa would not even be on this stage. You should be grateful. We gave you the tools, the schools, the governance that allowed you to even stand here today. Her words landed like stones in still water, hard, heavy, but quickly sinking. The audience murmured, some gasping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Gratitude? The suggestion was gasoline waiting for a spark, and Traoré's eyes carried the flame. He leaned forward, his voice calm yet cutting, every syllable resonating like a hammer striking iron. Grateful, he repeated slowly, almost tasting the word. You invade our lands, strip our resources, enslave our people, and when we rise from the ashes of what you destroyed, you demand thanks? Gratitude for surviving the fire you lit? That is not gratitude, it is endurance. And endurance belongs to us, not to you. The crowd erupted, their cheers rolling like thunder. Even those who had come skeptical of Traoré found themselves swept into the force of his conviction. Bondi tried to interrupt, but Traoré's momentum was unstoppable. You speak of tools and schools, he continued, his voice rising. But you did not build them for us, you built them for yourselves. Your roads were made to extract our minerals faster, your schools were designed to erase our languages, your governance was a cage painted in gold. And still, despite it all, Africa did not vanish. We are still here. Stronger. Louder. Unbroken. The studio shook with applause. Viewers across the globe flooded social media with clips of his speech, their captions echoing one message: Africa was speaking, and the world could no longer ignore it. Bondi's face tightened, her practiced confidence unraveling as Traoré's words carved through the narrative she tried to uphold. Pam Bondi blinked rapidly, her polished arguments unraveling like thread slipping from a spool. The studio lights bore down on her, and for the first time, she seemed smaller, cornered. Yet she wasn't ready to surrender. Straightening her back, she shot back with sharpness meant to reclaim control. You talk about survival, Mr. Traoré, but survival is not prosperity. Africa still relies on foreign aid, on Western systems, on rules we've set. Without those, your nations would collapse. That's the reality. Her words hung in the air like a blade, cold and cutting. Some in the audience nodded reluctantly, others whispered uneasily. It was the oldest argument: dependence, weakness, the claim that Africa's rise was tethered to the West. Traoré did not flinch. He stood, slowly, deliberately, his uniform catching the light as if to remind everyone he carried the weight of leadership, not just rhetoric. His voice cut through the tension like thunder splitting the sky. Collapse? Africa does not collapse, it is collapsed. Every chain, every intervention, every so-called aid package has been designed to keep us kneeling. And still, we rise. The audience erupted in applause, their cheers echoing like a tidal wave crashing against stone. Bondi's expression faltered again, and Traoré pressed forward, his words relentless. You call it aid, he continued, his tone fierce but unwavering. We call it a leash. Money that comes with conditions, loans that bury us in debt, agreements that rob us of sovereignty. That is not help, it is control. And Africa no longer accepts your leash. We are breaking it, link by link, until nothing binds us but our own will. The studio quaked with applause. Viewers online clipped the moment instantly, hashtags began to trend, hashtag no more chains, hashtag Africa rises, hashtag Traoré. For millions watching, it wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a declaration. Pam Bondi leaned back, her face stiff, her eyes scanning the crowd as though searching for support she could no longer command. Her silence grew louder than her words, and the world understood, Traoré had seized not only the stage, but the moment itself. The air in the studio shifted. What had begun as a political exchange now felt like a historical reckoning, as if centuries of silence had been broken in a single night. Pam Bondi, visibly rattled, adjusted her microphone, her voice sharper now, almost desperate. You speak as though the West has done nothing for Africa. But without our systems, our courts, our trade agreements, our governance, you wouldn't even have the platform you're speaking on today. We gave structure to chaos. Gasps rippled through the audience. Even Bondi's allies winced at her phrasing. chaos. It was a word that dripped with colonial arrogance, echoing centuries of prejudice. The silence that followed was suffocating. Traoré leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, his voice slow and deliberate, each word striking like a drumbeat. Chaos? You confuse resistance with chaos. You confuse independence with disorder. The only chaos Africa has known is the chaos imported by those who came with ships, guns, and contracts written in chains. The audience roared, applause crashing like thunder. Traoré raised his hand, and the room fell silent, waiting. His voice grew sharper, burning with intensity. If you call us chaos, it is because you fear what you cannot control. You think justice only exists when it is defined by you. But Africa has always had justice, our own systems, our own laws, our own ways of governing. They were destroyed, not lacking. You erased them to replace them with your image. Bondi's face hardened, but her silence betrayed her. The camera zoomed in, capturing every twitch, every flicker of discomfort. Clips of the exchange were already flooding social media. The hashtag #ChaosOrFreedom surged, sparking debates across the globe. Traoré finished, his voice steady yet thunderous. We don't need your rules to define our future. Africa's order is not born in Washington or Paris, it is born in Ouagadougou, Lagos, Kinshasa, Johannesburg. From our soil, for our people. That is order. That is justice. The eruption of applause was deafening. Some in the audience stood, clapping furiously, while Bondi sat frozen, her earlier confidence shattered. The message was clear. Traoré had turned the narrative upside down, leaving her arguments not just weakened, but irrelevant. The moderator tried to regain control of the stage, but the energy in the room was far beyond anything he could contain. The camera zoomed in on Bondi's rigid posture, her hands clasped tightly, her jaw clenched, as though she was fighting to keep her composure. She finally spoke, her tone sharp but unsteady. You speak of independence as if the modern world can exist without cooperation, without shared values. You cannot separate yourself from the structures we built. Trade, law, governance, they are the backbone of progress. Without them, your nations risk collapse. The words carried the air of authority, but the audience sensed desperation. Bondi was no longer leading the conversation, she was grasping at straws. Traoré leaned forward again, his eyes locked on hers. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Collapse? You call it collapse when we no longer bend to your rules. You mistake your control for our survival. That is the arrogance of empire, believing that without your hand, the world crumbles. The audience erupted in applause, shouts of approval rising like a wave. Hashtags multiplied online. #Empire Arrogance, #Africa Speaks, and #Traoré Unstoppable. But Traoré wasn't finished. His voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of centuries. Let me remind you, Africa's civilizations thrived long before Europe knew its own name. We built kingdoms, we governed ourselves, we traded across continents while others lived in shadows. What you call progress often came from theft. Gold, diamonds, oil, and even the lives of our people. And now you stand here and tell us we owe you gratitude? No. What we owe you is the truth. The applause turned into a roar, echoing off the studio walls. Bondi shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flickering toward the moderator as if pleading for intervention. But the stage was no longer hers, it belonged to Traoré and the history he represented. With a calm, almost chilling clarity, he concluded, Africa will not collapse without you. It will rise without you. That is what terrifies you most. The words struck like a hammer, leaving Bondi silent once more, her earlier confidence shattered into fragments. The studio was electrified, the walls vibrating with the intensity of the exchange. Bondi, visibly shaken, tried to compose herself. She straightened her shoulders, her voice trembling but still laced with defiance. You keep bringing up the past, Traoré, as if it gives you a license to disregard the present. The world has changed. We've established order, structure, and the legal frameworks that guide nations today. Without those, your countries will remain unstable, forever chasing shadows instead of building futures. Her words were calculated, but the delivery betrayed cracks. The camera caught the subtle twitch of her lips, the unease behind her eyes. The audience, however, wasn't buying it. A ripple of disapproval moved through the crowd, low murmurs, shaking heads, the restless shuffle of people no longer convinced by her arguments. Traoré stood taller, his presence commanding silence. He raised his hand slightly, as though calming a storm, before answering in a voice steady and resonant, "You speak of order, but what you call order was built on our chaos. What you call stability was secured through our suffering. And those legal frameworks? They were written not to guide us, but to bind us. To keep us dependent. To keep us silent." The audience erupted in thunderous applause, the sound drowning out even the microphones. Cameras panned across the crowd, faces lit with pride, some shouting Traoré's name, others chanting, "Africa rises." The online world was ablaze. Clips of his words were already spreading with captions like, "Truth Unchained," and "Traoré's Roar." Traoré pressed on, his voice sharp, almost surgical in its precision. "You accuse us of living in the past, yet you profit from it every day. Our resources fill your markets, our labor builds your industries, our suffering fuels your power. And when we demand control of our own destiny, you call it reckless. No. What's reckless is believing that Africa will forever be a pawn in your game." His final words in that moment rang with unshakable resolve. "We are not chasing shadows, Bondi. We are chasing the light of our own freedom. And nothing, you say can stop that march." The hall thundered with approval. Bondi's face, captured in close-up, revealed the truth. For the first time, she had no retort. The air inside the studio had become electric, every eye glued to the stage. Bondi clutched her notes tightly, but her hands trembled. For the first time, her polished words seemed powerless against the tidal wave of truth that Traoré had unleashed. She attempted a final push, her tone defensive yet weary. "You think fiery speeches will change the balance of the world? Power doesn't bend to rhetoric, it bends to law, to influence, to history. And that history is ours." A hush swept through the audience, a collective intake of breath. Bondi's words, intended as a final declaration of dominance, instead exposed the very arrogance Traoré had been dismantling piece by piece. Then Traoré leaned forward, his face calm but his eyes ablaze with conviction. His voice cut through the silence, steady as a drumbeat. "History is not yours to claim, Bondi. History belongs to those who lived it, who suffered it, who fought to change it. And Africa has written its own chapters with blood, sweat, and resilience. You tried to erase us. You tried to silence us. But here we stand, stronger than ever." The audience roared in approval, a wall of sound shaking the very walls of the studio. Hashtags like #TraoréTruth and #JusticeUnchained began trending worldwide within minutes. Screens lit up with clips replaying his words again and again, each repetition fueling the wildfire of his message. Traoré wasn't finished. He raised his hand once more, commanding silence with the weight of a true leader. "Power does not belong to those who cling to the past like a crutch. Power belongs to those who build the future with their own hands. And Africa will not ask for permission, nor bow to anyone's authority, to claim what is already ours: freedom, dignity, and justice." The closing shot captured Bondi sitting in silence, her expression a mask of defeat, while Traoré stood tall, unshaken, framed by the thunderous applause of the crowd. For millions watching worldwide, the image became iconic, a symbol of a continent reclaiming its voice. The confrontation was over, but the echo of Traoré's words would ripple far beyond the studio.